Rabbi Julia Andelman, Director of Community Engagement at JTS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you a couple minutes late to our summer series of Wandering People, Jewish Journeys, Real and Imagined. And we're so pleased to have a guest faculty member today, one of our own esteemed alumni, Dr. Jonathan Ray, to teach us about the expulsion from Spain, certainly a Jewish journey that that sort of lives in all of our minds for centuries after the fact. Stacy, if you can actually put up the sponsorship information again, because I'm not able to get to it. I do want to very much thank our sponsors for today, or you can put them in the chat either way. Great, thank you. So thank you so much to Len Wasserman, who is sponsoring at the Tzaddik level, the $1,000 level, in honor of Rachel Rosenthal, Dr. Rachel Rosenthal, who taught us so wonderfully last week, as well as Edward and Marion Bromberg, sponsoring at the Chacham level in honor of their granddaughter starting this college this coming semester. So thank you. Also, the Brombergs were so excited to meet your granddaughters and welcome them at JTS in just a couple of weeks. For anyone on the call, if you're inspired by this learning opportunity, please do consider partnering with us to sponsor a learning session in the future. We have a fall series coming up. Stay tuned. We'll be announcing it in the next week or two. So Dr. Ray will be pausing a couple of times for questions, and if you'd like to submit a question, please send it to me via the chat, Rabbi Julia Andelman. And if you have a question or issue of a technical or logistical nature, you can send that via the chat to Stacy Firestone or Lynn Feynman. I think that's what I've got. Because of my frozen screen, I do not even have your bio up in front of me, Dr. Ray, but I know that it's in the source sheet that everyone received, so I'm going to rely on everyone to read that. But we're so pleased that you're here, and I turn it over to you to begin the teaching. And you're muted.
Is that better? Okay, good. So we've gotten the first technical hurdle out of the way. We'll see what else comes our way, but thank you very much, Julia. And thanks for all of you for joining this afternoon in what I understand has been a really great series so far, and I'm very happy to be part of it. As Julia mentioned, I'm going to speak to you a little bit today about the expulsion of the Jews from Spain and the journeys that Sephardic Jews took in the formation of the Sephardic diaspora. And we're going to pause a couple of times to have questions, and at the end, there'll be plenty of time for more questions as we wrap up. And I'll also try, we'll see how successful we're going to be at sharing my screen with you to look at some texts together today. Hopefully you were able to receive the text beforehand, but if not to worry, we'll go over them together. And there won't be any tests. So this is the best kind of summer school. None of this really counts towards your graduation. So when we talk about the expulsion of Jews from Spain, we tend to think about it as the end of something. Very often the end, the sad afterward of something glorious, that this was the end of over 1,000 years of Jewish civilization in Spain, the civilization of Judah Halevi and Nachmanides and Maimonides. So very often when this story gets told, it's the story of endings, of a golden age of Jewish life. And in fact, other accounts begin to focus on it as a transfer of Sephardic identity from Spain to the Ottoman Empire, which is often said to be a group that welcomed the Sephardic refugees with open arms, giving them a new beginning and really the beginning of another golden age. And while both of these points of view have merit, we miss something in between when we look at it from these two poles. There's a lot that goes on really at the end of Jewish life in Spain and at the beginning of Jewish life in the Ottoman Empire and other major places of Sephardic settlement. And that's what we're going to talk about today, to look at the complexities of life in the 16th and 17th century, as Jews don't make their way directly from one country to another, but really spend generations in wandering. So first of all, I want to say that tragic though the expulsion of 1492 may have been, it did not represent a clean break, or at least not as clean a break as we might think. Many Jews, in fact, stayed behind in Spain. albeit not as professing Jews. Jews had to convert to Catholicism in order to be allowed to stay in their hometowns. Moreover, as we will see, many who left soon had to return to Spain. So 1492 maybe isn't the clean break with Jewish life there as we might imagine. And secondly, the notion of Jews leaving one golden age to begin another's is also somewhat problematic. Beginning in 1492, the dispossessed embarked on a series of journeys to Italy, to Holland, to North Africa, and as we'll see, to some of the colonial possessions of Spain, Portugal, and Holland in the New World. And it was there that they began to transform themselves into a new Sephardic diaspora with its own set of identities and its own culture. So today, we're going to look at 1492 not as an end, but as a beginning of a long period of Jewish migrations. So let's begin with the expulsion itself. Jews were expelled for a complex set of reasons, but most notably to stop their influence or their perceived influence on the Conversos. Now, for over a century, large numbers of Jews had converted to Catholicism throughout Spain for a variety of reasons, but most notably under the threat of violence. During times of mob riots, Jews would promise to convert if they could save their lives. And so a growing number of conversos, or marranos as they are sometimes called, grew up in Spain who were nominally Catholic, but often had ties with their former Jewish friends and neighbors. This was not, this fact of these ties was not lost on their new Christian friends and neighbors. So there was an idea that conversos were nominally Catholic, but if you scratch the surface, many of them were secret or crypto Jews. For the Jews of Spain, this ongoing set of conversions for the century before 1492 had its own negative effects. Families were split apart. You have brothers, some of whom were now Catholic, some of whom were Jewish. Neighbors, former business partners, extended families were broken apart. Jewish communities were broken apart. Jews were left without their rabbis. Rabbis were left without their congregants, right? And in neither case was it quite clear whether these conversos were considered to be fully Catholic or fully Jewish. This was an open and contentious area of debate. And so because of this debate, we see the establishment of a new royal, what's often called Spanish Inquisition, that's established around 1480. And as the Inquisition inquires into the situation of the conversos, are they good Catholics? Are they secret Jews? If they are not good Catholics, what seems to be the cause? The findings that come to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain are that the conversos will never fully embrace Christianity as long as they have Jewish friends and family members nearby who can secretly tell them how to observe Jewish rites and customs. And so the so-called Catholic monarchs agreed to expel their Jewish subjects. The Jews did not have to leave necessarily, though. They had a choice. They could stay if they were willing to accept baptism. And as many of these Jews saw that it was possible to be a converso and perhaps still keep some element of Jewish identity, then it made it perhaps easier to convert and tell themselves one day when the time was right, they would be able to revert openly to Judaism, possibly when the current situation changed or the problems blew over. And we can imagine, even for those who desperately wanted to stay Jewish, the decision to leave was not an easy one. We have to consider what it meant for these people to leave. Now, it's always hard to leave behind things you know, to leave behind the graves of your ancestors, to leave behind your business, to leave behind all of the protections and connections and family that you have, to go abroad to a country you've never been to before without any family connections, without any guarantee that you'll have the protection of the local lords there, without any guarantee you'll be able to make a living there. All of these things are quite daunting. And for most Jews in 1492, they had never left Spain. In fact, many of them had never left their hometowns before. It's true, there were some long distance merchants, but really very few. And the unknown is terrifying, especially for Jews who knew that no matter where they go, they're not going to be welcomed with open arms. Moreover, the Jews didn't have much time to leave. The actual declaration of the expulsion edict came at the very beginning of May, and the Jews had 3 months to sell all their goods, pack up, and make it out of Spain. And when I say make it out, there are only certain points of departure, certain port cities or certain places on land where you could cross over into neighboring Portugal. Portugal is the only other country you could actually walk to. Everything else you had to get on a boat, you'd have to pay to leave. And less than scrupulous boat captains and less than scrupulous officials at the Portuguese border, we know, held up some of these Jewish refugees for exorbitant fees in order to be able to leave. This was technically illegal, but there was not anyone really to hold them to account. And so to leave behind everything you know, to start a life anew, to find your way out of Spain in a short amount of time was impossible for a lot of people. Many of them made it to the border or to these port cities and were turned back for one reason or another. And so they accepted baptism and stayed as conversos, but we know that many of those people who made the decision to stay in 1492 did so with a heavy heart, and therefore we can guess that many of them did, at least in the short run, try to live as best they could as secret Jews. So what happens to those who do make it? The refugees, mostly in Castile or in the western part of Spain, I'll have a map up in a little bit, make it to Portugal. The rest have to leave by ports that connect the Iberian mainland to Italy and to North Africa. No one got on a ship in Valencia and made it all the way to Istanbul. That was not a route that you could take. So if maybe we see Jews going from Spain to the Ottoman Empire, it takes years to get there. For many, it's generations. The people who end up in the Ottoman Empire were born in Italy or born in North Africa of parents and sometimes grandparents who left Spain. And so we have to think of this as being a very long process. We also know that unscrupulous boat captains very often took the Jews out into the ocean or into the Mediterranean Sea and then shook them down for more money, saying they would throw them overboard or kill them or rape their women, or in fact did so and then held them up for more money, promising they would never leave the boat unless they did what they were told. Why was this able to happen? Well, travel in the pre-modern world was never easy, and these sorts of highway robbery of different kinds do happen to all sorts of people. But the Jews are particularly vulnerable at this point because they have lost their Lord. The king and queen of Spain up until now were the protectors of their Jews. We might think you could wish for better protectors sometimes, but generally speaking, you know, if you killed a Jew, if you harmed a Jew, a member of that Jew's family could take you to trial. There were laws. And as the king and queen saw the Jews as their personal subjects, you were attacking the king's Jews. Whether or not they liked these subjects or not is not the point. You couldn't kill a deer in the royal forest without permission, and you couldn't attack a royal subject like a Jew without permission, and there were penalties to pay up until 1492. Once the Jews are kicked out, they are without a lord. And until they are able to establish a new set of settlement contracts with new lords somewhere in Italy or North Africa, they're free game. So you're out there on the high seas with really no one to protect you. If you're killed and thrown overboard, there's no one to bring charges of murder. And so it's a terrifying experience for these Jews who leave. Those who do make landfall often find that they're not allowed to disembark. Not a lot of people are looking to have large numbers of Jews settle in their community at this period. And you have to imagine this is a massive refugee community. It's not 15 or 20 people, it's thousands of people. And most people don't want thousands of the poor and dispossessed showing up in their town. So maybe some Jews, the wealthier Jews, the Jews who could hide jewels or other valuables sewn into their clothing, they were able to bribe their way onto ship through the passage and then off ship into their new places of settlement. The rest, the poorer Jews, the Jews who left without nothing, often went from one port to another, and if at a certain point they couldn't find a way to land, they were going to be taken back to Spain and discharged back in their homeland. So there were people who stayed in the ports for months waiting to leave, were at sea for months, were waylaid in one port after another, and finally, after a year or more, wound up back in Spain where they originally tried to leave. So this was a very difficult set of problems that was facing them. And then what happens to the Jews who actually do find their way on land, either in North Africa or Italy? There's no FEMA, there's no UNESCO, there's no group that's there to settle these refugees. So it's really catch as catch can. If you're out of bribe money, you're depending on either the largesse of the local Jewish community to intervene on your behalf, which does happen at times, or the new lords who think, okay, these bedraggled Jews could serve me one day. I'm going to take them under my protection to see whether or not I can find them to be useful. But in both those cases, Jewish protection and royal protection or lordly protection from Christian and Muslim lords, very often you get only a portion of the Jews taken in. And once again, you're asked to be shunted to the next town down the line. Very few towns can take large numbers of refugees. And even the ones who accept them, even the Jews who say, please, my Lord, accept our brethren that we may give them some sort of help here, there's no place to house them. So very often Jews are sleeping outside the walled cities of North Africa, in the desert. We have stories of them burrowing into garbage heaps at night in order to stay warm. The garbage heaps being outside the city walls, that's where you dump your garbage. And that's where these Jews were attempting to stay. Very often they don't have tents. They're not even in tent cities. They're just exposed to the elements. And so we can imagine that return and conversion looks pretty good at a certain point. You think, well, I don't want to become Christian. I don't want to give up my Jewish identity. I don't want to convert to Islam here, which is also an option in North Africa. But I want to live. I have to first protect my soul and my flesh, and then later on, maybe I can revert back to Judaism if possible. But perhaps the most harrowing chapter of that first generation that leaves Spain is among those who go to Portugal. Again, this was the Jews from Western Spain or Castile who walk quite a distance across the mountains into Portugal. Many of them are totally fleeced at the border, so they enter into Portugal with absolutely nothing to their name. Some Jews who arrive at the border without enough money to bribe the guards are forced to escape in some area along the border where there's no guards. And so you have a large number of illegal Jews showing up in Portugal without having registered and whose names don't appear anywhere. This is a problem. Though we might think of the Middle Ages as a time without very good record keeping, there is some record keeping. And Jews who show up in a particular city, in a particular parish, who don't appear on royal lists of Jews who legally came to the country are considered to be criminals, and they are captured and enslaved. So now again, not only do you not have any lord to protect you, now you are fully enslaved as people who are without a lord and who have broken the law, and you are really freely at the mercy of your new lords. In addition to those who are enslaved for not coming into the country legally, there are others who have their children taken away in order to force them to pay taxes to their new lord, pleading that we were not allowed to leave with much money. We spent everything we could to come into your country, O King of Portugal. Really didn't play well. The king said, you're here now. If you're not a taxable property for me, I have no use for you. So find a way to come up with the tax money or risk severe punishment. And in a way to squeeze the Jews to make them pay money that the Portuguese king thinks they're holding out, he takes away many of their children. And what happens to their children? A variety of things. Some of them are baptized, thinking that if we force the Jews to pay us money and they don't, we can baptize their kids and that will force them to follow them into baptism. So we'll get them to convert that way. Others, we have chronicles, both Christian and Jewish chronicles of the time, which tell us that a certain number of these children who are taken away from their parents are sent off to the island of Sao Tome. Sao Tome is an equatorial island off the coast of Africa, off the coast of Cameroon, very, very far from Portugal, but one of the trading entrepot that Portugal has now established along the coast of Africa. And they're going to be forced to become Christian settlers there. So are these, when we think of a combination of Oliver Twist and Lord of the Flies, there are these colonies of young Jews dumped there to do plantation labor and to build up a Christian colony there. And they're never heard from again. We hear stories that most of them end up dying of disease. And so if you're a Jew in Portugal and you see these are your options, convert and go back to Spain. Hopefully not get captured by the authorities, hopefully not have your children torn from you. It's a terrifying experience. And there's a lot of Jews who do return to Spain. They say, look, if inevitably we're going to lose out as Jews, we have to convert one way or the other, we might as well convert and return back to Spain, where at least I can make a play for recovering my house, recovering my property. At least I know the lay of the land there, know the language. I'm a stranger in Portugal. And although the Portuguese Jewish community did what they could to shelter some of the refugees, they're overwhelmed. They can't shelter all of them. But it's not too long that King Manuel of Portugal comes up with yet another plan. He argues that all of these efforts to push the Jews either to convert or to become contributing members of the royal coffers isn't really reaching the ends that he wants. And so he declares that all Jews are going to be expelled. And he leads these Jews down to certain ports of embarkation. It's going to be a lot like Spain a few years earlier. This is in 1486, just a few years after the Jews get there. And at the last minute, he changes his mind and decides to forcibly convert them. Now that he has all the Jews together, penned in, ready to depart, he says, from now on, all Jews in Portugal, those who were Portuguese Jews long before 1492, and the Spanish refugees, from this moment forth, you're all Christian. By royal fiat, Judaism is outlawed, and you guys are all going to be Christian. Much like in Spain, these new Christians in Portugal were generally rejected by many of the so-called old Christians. They argued, you didn't really convert because you love or embrace Christianity. You converted because of a royal law. And so you're not Christian like we are. And the same cycle of tensions, accusations of crypto-Judaism, and the establishment of a new Portuguese Inquisition follow suit. And so the Jews really do go from the frying pan into the fire. They left everything in order to stay Jewish, and they ended up losing their Judaism anyway. So by 1497, you have no professing Jews left anywhere in the Iberian Peninsula, with the one notable exception of the small Pyrenean kingdom of Navarre, who make the same convert or get out edict in 1498. So there we are, just a few years after 1492, we've had Jews, some of whom have left everything and still got converted. Some of them converted and returned home to a hostile Christian populace, some of whom will end up as beggars in North Africa or Italy. I should also mention in both in North Africa and in Italy, the Jewish refugees are greeted by a pandemic. One of the worst outbreaks of the plague that had ravaged Europe for years had just begun again. And not only are the Jews living outside, unprotected, with no medical care, dying of the plague, they're seen as newcomers, as possible agents of the plague. And so those of us who are, living through a pandemic of our own can understand and imagine the terror that these Jews are living through, that they don't know if they're going to survive. They don't know who is going to protect them or how that protection is going to come. They are seen as disease-ridden, and therefore, even those Jews in Italian and North African cities that would like to help their brethren basically say, everyone says your ship is full of plague. We can't. We'll be attacked and killed if we sponsor you into this city. And so those first Jews who do make their way to land as professing Jews, not as converts, in Italy and in North Africa, do so against terrible odds. And they're only really a small fraction of the Jews who actually existed in Spain in 1492. So that's the first phase of the journey out of Spain. Let's pause here and stop for some questions, and then we can look at some texts together, go through a little bit more. Whoever's moderating the questions can take hold.
That's me. Okay, lots of questions. So I just kind of put them into 3 different families here. So the first is kind of some general context about the Jews in Spain. When did they get there? Where were they? And looking at the whole Jewish population in say Eurasia or this part of the world at that time, what percentage of the Jews were in Spain?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have a great answer, so sorry, but I'll give you the best I can. So we know Jews are in the Iberian Peninsula from Roman times. How many were there? We don't know. There's evidence of Jews there really in Roman Hispania. They're there, so from the late antique period, from the 3rd century on up, at least. We have better records of large numbers of Jews in the peninsula from the 10th century on, living mostly at first under Muslim rule and then under Christian rule. By the time they're kicked out in 1492, the Jews in Spain are one of the largest Jewish communities in the world. In part, that's because the Jews of England are expelled from their kingdom in 1290. The Jews are expelled from France in different times over the 14th century. Different sectors of German Jewry as part of the patchwork Holy Roman Empire are expelled over the 14th century too. The numbers of Jews in larger centers like Baghdad, Cairo, and Alexandria decline in the 15th century. And so Jewish populations throughout the world are on the decline. And one of the last most stable, most protected, most prosperous Jewish communities in the world was the Jewish community of Spain. So when they leave, not only, we have to imagine, not only is this terrifying for them, if you're in a small Italian community in Rome or in northern Italy of a few hundred family, and you hear, Paris is burning, essentially, like our best chance for us to go if things get badly here has just fallen out, and they're coming here. You think, wait, the Jews of Spain are coming here asking us for help? We're all in trouble.
So it sounds like the reason 1492 looms so large for us even now is because it had an impact on the entire Jewish people, the way you're describing it.
Yeah, I would say, Julia, it would be like if the Jews of the U.S. were expelled today.
That's what I was just thinking, but I hesitated to say it.
No, sure. And you're a Jew in London or Paris thinking, oh,
yeah,
that was my, or Buenos Aires, that was my ace in the hole. We could always go to New York, perhaps. Now New York's not an option. Yikes.
Right. Okay. The next group of questions are about conversos and conversion. So one person was asking what percentage of Jews didn't convert, and the second question was, were Jews expelled irrespective of their conversions? Meaning, conversos, Jews who didn't convert, was it just was a converso expelled if their particular conversion or they were suspect in some way?
Right. So Jews are converting from the 1390s to 1492. So it's hard to say percentages. In 1492, of the Jews who start the year as professing Jews, most of them leave. A smaller percentage of them choose conversion. But none of the conversos were asked to leave. In fact, they were forbidden to leave. So the goal seems to be get the Jews to stay with all their goods by converting, and then we will clamp down on them and insist that they observe religious rites properly. Both in both Spain and later Portugal, once you convert, you're forbidden to leave, you're forbidden to trade. So you can't say, I'm going out for cigarettes, right? I'll be right back. You can't leave the country. There's a moratorium on converso or new Christians traveling for several years. Now, there are some who avoid that law and evade it, but for the most part, Jews are allowed to leave and forced to leave. Conversos are not allowed to leave for a number of years afterwards.
Great, thank you. Okay, and the third family of questions here is kind of the perennial why. Why do they hate us? One person
we may not have full time to answer that, but we'll try. Yeah, go ahead.
So how much did it potentially have to do with money lending? Was there Vatican involvement in this? And then actually a few people asked, was it really just the Jews, or were Muslims also discriminated against in a similar way?
Right. So these are great questions. And really there's a whole course, a year-long course we could take to unravel them. But let me just say this, on the why they hate the Jews, that's a bigger question. Why the Jews are expelled. Now, it's tied to the conversos. Really, as I said, Jews being Jewish is acceptable in Spain and Portugal. Once you convert, you are not allowed to, observe Havdalah or any Jewish rites, right? So if they find you lighting candles in the basement on Friday night, if they find that you're fasting during Yom Kippur, you're a heretic, and that's a problem. with the conversos, there's this feeling that they will always be heretics or susceptible to heresy once they have Jews passing them in the marketplace, whispering, Jewish girls light candles at 5:45 p.m. today on Friday, right? So the Inquisition comes back and says, we will never really get these guys to fully embrace our Catholic faith. They'll all be potential heretics, and they'll spread the heresy among old Christians if we don't get rid of the Jewish influence. At first, Jews are expelled from one city to the next. They're expelled from one region where it's particularly bad to another region. And the argument is, this is just passing the problem. We need to get the Jews out. There are economic reasons. The Jews were in decline. The conversos had taken over many of their jobs. They became a more taxable asset. So it's easier to expel the Jews for their Christian lords. They become expendable because of the conversions in small part. But there are a variety of reasons that go into this. Whether or not we can look back and say, that was actually a bad fiscal decision, that's another question. They believed it to be a fiscal decision that the king and queen, that wouldn't hurt them. So that becomes the reason.
And can you just address the piece about Muslims too?
Oh, sure. So this is because the real reason, or the central reason, let's just say, the Jews are asked to leave is because their potential influence in the converts. That's not an issue with Islam. A little epilogue to the story. Once the Jews are out, the same cycle takes place during the next century with the Muslims. Muslims are forcibly converted. Those Muslims who aren't converted are seen as, suborning bad behavior and heresy among the converted Muslims, and the Muslims are kicked out. Not the converted Muslims, but the Muslims who are left around. So yeah, this cycle happens again.
So it's convert everyone we can and then insulate them from all those who didn't convert.
Right, absolutely. And by the way, to this day, there are people in Spain and Portugal who say, oh, that family has Jewish blood or Muslim blood in usually a negative sense, without any real reason. It's just a way of saying they're no good nicks, right? You can tell they have bad blood in their family tree. They're never going to amount to much, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, they're greedy. Oh, they're criminal. You can tell they have, sangre judía. And people will be called Jews in the 21st century because they believed to 1,000 years ago have a Jewish ancestor. That thinking is alive and well. I don't want to say everyone in Spain thinks this way, but it is alive and well in Spain and Portugal today. Okay. So should we continue? All right, we're gonna move on. We'll have another chance for some more questions a little bit later. So what does it mean when the dust begins to settle in? Those Jews who are able to make it as Jews outside of Spain, and they scratch and claw and cling to life in North Africa and in Italy. And some of them eventually make it to the Ottoman Empire and others to the New World. What is life like? How do you reconstruct a community? You have to remember, whole communities don't leave on the same boat with their communal council and their treasurer and their rabbis and their rabbinic court. It's chaos. Families are split apart. Communities are split apart. How do you reestablish yourselves? And there are 1,000 different ways this happens. In some areas, if you're a very small group of Jews, you get subsumed into the local Jewish community. You eventually give up your local language, your original language. You learn Arabic. You learn, 15th century versions of Italian. You learn Turkish, etc., and you become subsumed into that community. But where larger numbers of Sephardim are able to settle, they are able to cling to their language, their culture. They set up their own kehilot. They set up their own communities, and they establish new communal councils. They circle around rabbis who are able to find their way to the similar towns. So you might imagine Jews from an Aragonese town like Saragossa might end up studying in yeshiva of a rabbi from Castile, because that was the closest thing they found to someone of their own heritage in Rome or in Salonika or in some other city throughout the Mediterranean coast. So there are regroupings and new amalgamations of people whose real shared background was one of expulsion. In other words, they didn't speak, some spoke Portuguese, some spoke Spanish, some spoke Catalan or Valencian or other related but different languages. Some of them knew each other, most of them did not, but they were all expelled and went through hell at the same time. And that really forged a new Sephardic identity for them. They find themselves then as groups of Megurashim, or the expelled, living together as a community in Rome, in Salonika, in Fez, in Istanbul, and communicating with each other, sometimes more than they communicated with the Jews in their own town. So the Sephardic diaspora is built by a sort of common bond and a common crisis. So what this means is that you might look for work or look for a spouse among Sephardic refugees living in a different country. You're in Italy, they're in Tunisia, because you believe there's some sort of a bond you have there more than you would look for work or work for a spouse among Ashkenazi Jews or Italian Jews or other Jews living in Rome with you. So the Sephardic diaspora lives, or it grows among other nodes of Jewish settlement, but they don't always play nicely with or integrate with these other Jewish ethnic groups. And it's at this time ethnicity begins to play an even larger role than it ever has among the Jewish world, the different nodes of the Jewish world. That's not to say that Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews didn't see differences before. They did, but they weren't thrown together in quite the same way. I should say parenthetically, I mentioned a little bit about the 14th century people being expelled out of England and France and the German lands. Those Jews are also, some of them moving east into what is today Poland and Lithuania, but some of the Jews are also showing up in the Mediterranean. And we see that those Ashkenazi Jews, we have a whole course on Ashkenazi expulsions as well, they're moving around. The wealthier Jews being able to establish themselves in these new areas of settlement, in Poland, let's say, in Vienna for a time, etc. But many of the poor go from town to town. Sometimes they convert in order to get Christian charity, and then they go to the next town and say, I never converted in the last town, and they play this game. They're called Beetlejuden or Schalantjuden, these Jews who are seen as being liars just to hold body and soul together. So both the Sephardic and early Ashkenazi diasporas of the 15th and 16th century caused a new set of relationships to exist among Jewish ethnic groups, and also a growing number of Jewish poor becomes a problem for the different kihilot on whose margins they begin to live. I think very often wealth becomes something that we're somewhat uncomfortable to talk about when we talk about Jewish history, but in this particular period, wealth or the lack of it is a major factor in why Jews travel. Many of these poor Jews who float from town to town would very much like to settle down, but there's no one really who will take them in. They become the artisan version of day laborers. They'll work in a person's shop as a tanner or a dyer or a cutter or a shoemaker, very often in the needle trades, in metalworking or leatherworking for a period of time until they're no longer needed and they move on to the next town. Sometimes, if they're lucky, with a letter from the Jewish community saying, these are good Jews, but we just really have no place for them. Hopefully you can take pity on them and take them in. But very often they just show up. And you can imagine, these are already taxed and beleaguered Jewish communities. It's all they can do to help 10 or 12 people a year. When 400 show up during a bad winter, there's not that much a Jewish community can do, even if it wants to. And to be honest, not all Jews are that charitable all of the time. So from the point of view of the refugees, you're born into poverty, you're born into a city that probably you'll never see again, you're constantly moving. Families, in the hope that their children will actually live, usually split them up because no one wants to take in 3 kids. So you'll send them in 3 different directions. Hopefully you'll be able to get in touch with each other. Maybe you'll be able to, but very often you are sacrificing a lot just for survival. Those wealthier Jews who are able to establish themselves as merchants and moneylenders in the 16th and early 17th century are the ones who usually gain fame for historians. We can talk about some of them, like Manasseh ben Israel, we'll look at in a minute, or Dona Gracia, who's a conversa from Portugal, who is a very wealthy woman as a Catholic and leaves and reverts back to Judaism, probably in Italy, but then officially in the Ottoman Empire. And she runs sort of an underground railroad. She sees it as her charitable duty to help people less fortunate than she is make it out of what they call the lands of idolatry, out of Spain and Portugal, so they may revert to Judaism and live a good Jewish life in the Ottoman Empire or wherever they can. And so there are some of the wealthier patrons of the Jews who do feel very responsible and do what they can to try to help Jews find freedom. But there are just not enough of them. And as much as we should recognize the works of some of these great leaders, we also have to imagine if we lived at that time, the percentage chance that we would live well or be taken care of or settle in one place for the rest of our life or settle in the same place as our kids or have a Doña Gracia out there giving us charity, it was like 10 to 1. The vast majority of these people throughout the 16th and the 17th century lived on the margins of society. And you can imagine the reputation that that gave the Jewish community as a whole in the eyes of their Christian and Muslim neighbors. So I want to take a look in a minute. I'm going to share my screen with you, but let me sort of get set up here in a minute to show you first a map and then a document from this time to give you some sense of what we're talking about trying to find your way to a new community. So let's see. All right, so hopefully you can see this map. This is, it's not a great map, but it'll give you some sense of the Jews here in Spain and where they go. The majority first go from this part of Spain to Portugal, but those who leave from Valencia, from southern Spain, from Granada, can end up in these other areas. This one line, which goes all the way to the Ottoman Empire, that actually is a misrepresentation. I don't have a good map to show you. This is the best map I have. This takes several generations for most people. There are a couple who leave Spain and before they die are able to work their way across the Mediterranean and end up here in Istanbul or Constantinople here, or make it to Salonika, which becomes a major center for Jewish refugees, Sephardic refugees, by the end of the century. But for the most part, they're going to be living here in the Western Mediterranean. Many of them, after not being able to be allowed in one of the Italian cities after another, are sent back to Spain. And then in the second and third generation of the exile, as it's called, there's a question of whether you want to leave Spain and Portugal and hazard all of these terrible things I've spoken about to try to make it to Constantinople or Salonika or the Republic of Venice here, where you're told things are slightly better. And I want to look at one of these texts, which is a story of this time. It comes from a tshuva or a responsum, a rabbinic responsum from this period of Rabbi David Hakohen, who is a Greek rabbi living at the time in the Ottoman Empire, watching these refugees come in and being asked, how do we Jews living here who are not from Spain look at these refugees and handle them? So hopefully you can read this. If not, maybe you have the document at hand that you can read with me. I'm not going to read every word of it. We're going to skip around a little bit, but I want to start with the question. This question, which was written off to this rabbi, was, the question concerns one of the apostates who left the religion of Israel for idolatry, that is to say, became Christian, because of the decree of the government in those days, which decreed that the Jews change from the religion of Israel to the religion of Baal. And they're referring here to the decree of Manuel I of Portugal. So we're talking about the Portuguese and Spanish Jews living in Portugal in the 1490s. So this apostate was murdered on the road by robbers who gave his flesh to the birds of the heaven and the beasts of the field. But now his son, the son of this apostate, is a Jew. So whether or not the son left before dad, did the son live in 1492 and the dad went to Portugal? Hard to know, but we have a professing Jew who made it all the way. This is from the Ottoman Empire. He's living as a Jew. His dad attempts to join him there, but is killed before he can reach his son. The son desires to say Kaddish for the repose of the soul of his father. However, there are other mourners whose fathers died as Jews living in this Ottoman congregation. Do these other mourners, have precedence in saying the Kaddish? Or shall we say that although this mourner's father was slain while an apostate, he has to say Kaddish on the same basis as the others? I like the way the questioner put it. Does this mourner have to say Kaddish? Clearly the mourner wants to say Kaddish. It's his neighbors at the synagogue say, wait. Your dad died as a Catholic. I'm saying Kaddish for my dad first. In fact, I'm not sure I want you to say Kaddish for your dad. It's not clear to us you should have the same honors in synagogue that we have, that you should have the support of the congregation. Your dad wasn't Jewish. My dad was. And so we see a sense of perhaps tension, one-upmanship, a lack of a charitable spirit, perhaps, among some Jews in this congregation towards conversos, or Jews whose family were converts. And I want to take a look at the rabbi's answer, because in some elements, although it's a long legal text, it is revealing. Let's start with this next page here on 148. He goes by and says, look, there are different converts. Some of them convert because they are trying to provocatively attack Judaism. They become real Catholics. And some are converting to save their souls, to save their bodies anyway. He starts here in the middle of his answer. As for the fact that they remained there, that is to say in Spain and Portugal, and did not flee, it is for their benefit that they stay there. That is to say, they are just trying to not get in trouble. If they appear to serve Baal, if they appear as Catholics, it's under compulsion that they not be slain. Thus, of course, they transgress against the commandment that they shouldn't do this, etc., etc. However, he goes on to say, other great rabbis like Asher ben Yechiel have said, there is a difference between people who are waiting to escape and pretending to be Catholic and those who actually become good Catholics. He jumps down to this next paragraph. All the more is this so with regard to this apostate who, as I have heard, was slain. He had come as far as Arta, this is the city on the Adriatic coast, as you see, to return to Judaism, and was robbed on the road and lost all his money, and therefore returned a while to the kingdom of Portugal. This is where it gets interesting. So, okay, he goes from, if you remember that map, from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. Bring it up again. He goes from Portugal to the Ottoman Empire over here, okay, on the Adriatic coast over here, towards near Patras. Patras is where the rabbi is writing. So Arta is near there. He goes from Lisbon all the way to Patras, gets in sight of his son's congregation, gets robbed, goes back. He decides to go back, basically saying, I want to live as a Jew. I want to escape Portugal, but I'm not starting over at my age without any money. I got business dealings in Portugal. I'm going back there. When I can raise enough money to retire well, I'll return to Patras and the Arta area. So the plot thickens. We might see why some of these congregants might think, your dad could have left 20 years ago. In fact, I heard he left last year, came here, and then went back. And that's when he was killed. So you can imagine that some of these congregants are raising an eyebrow as to the Jewishness or the dedication to Judaism of some of these conversos, like their friend's father. Then he was, the tshuva picks up, then he was on the way back here to come to Arta, and on this journey, robbers seized him, took all that he had to return there. So there is a reason for our belief that this poor man did not stay in Portugal to provoke Judaism as a real Catholic, but for his benefit. The very kind reading of the rabbi is, he wanted to come here, he showed he wanted to come here, but he came all the way here and only went back to make money. He didn't go back to live as a Catholic. I think the congregants agreed with the rabbi, but the idea that you would put financial benefit in front of an observant Jewish life was one that they had problems with. And they are not the only ones. We can see this repeated in other areas of the Sephardic diaspora. Furthermore, we continue here, when he was slain, he achieved atonement. So the attempt to live as a Jew and then being killed for your money was akin to martyrdom. He atoned himself because he was trying to do the right thing. There might be other rabbis, and we do see other rabbis reading similar cases with a much more harsh point of view, saying, first generation, we understand. Second generation, third generation, you guys are staying there to make money. You could escape, and you're choosing to live a comfortable life as a false Catholic rather than a poor but honest life as a Jewish beggar. And we are not okay with that. So these are the sort of decisions that one has to face. And each Jew who makes it into diaspora has his own or her own opinion of the people who stayed behind. Some of them are like our rabbi here, Rabbi Cohen, say, they're not actual Catholics, so we can't call them true, Epicorsim. They're not doing it for any reason other than they're being forced to do it. And there are some who roll their eyes at that and say, forced. My dad got out, took him 10 years, but he got out. And that was 40 years ago. Why has your family been there the whole time? So there are those with less charitable views of those staying behind. Some look at a figure like Doña Gracia, this widow who becomes this patron to the arts, patron to Jewish writing, and a patron to establish synagogues for Jews, and helps Jews, conversos, leave, find their way to the Ottoman Empire. She supports all this. But someone says, yeah, she waited till she had enough money and then she left. I'm glad she's paying it back to the community, but a real dedicated Jew would have left the first chance she got, not when she inherited all her money. So there are a variety of different takes on this. There are a variety of different, and I'm going to stop sharing for the moment here. There are a variety of different attitudes and opinions that the Jews of the diaspora have towards each other. And this is going to be true throughout the Jewish world. If other Sephardic Jews say, hey, my cousins got out, why didn't your cousins? My cousins are real Jews, or I'm a real Jew and you're not. You can imagine how Arabized Jews in North Africa, Italian Jews in Italy, Ashkenazi Jews everywhere view the Sephardim. I feel bad for your troubles, but at this point, it's not 1490 anymore, it's 1590, it's 1620, it's 1650. How long are we supposed to look at you guys as victims instead of people who got pretty comfortable there in Spain and Portugal? I should add, we should remember now, in the 16th and 17th century, Spain and Portugal are the richest countries in Europe, right? They've just found silver and gold mines, right? They're in control of the pepper trade around the world. These are, Lisbon and Madrid are New York and Paris of our own day. And so the people who say, I didn't see you guys rushing to get out of there. Your great-great-great-grandma converted. Come on now. Those who are living as poor Jews in other areas of the world are especially, harsh on some of these conversos who only in the late 17th century, begin to leave. And the question of poverty is a tough one. On the one hand, what do we expect Jewish communities to do? They are overwhelmed by a refugee crisis that is not of their own making. Their religion tells them they should do what they can for the orphan and the widow and the beggar, but there's only so much they can do. And they would argue, by saying they can support more Jews than they actually can, they're going to sever what good ties they have left with their Christian and Muslim lords, and the next thing they know, they are kicked out. And so they have this difficult choice. How many Jews can they help? Maybe they can help them for a day, for a week, for a while. If you can't find them work, what do you do? And this problem of wandering Jews, not only Sephardim, but also Ashkenazim, dominates much of early modern Jewish life, 16th, the 17th, and into the 18th centuries. We can pause here again for some questions.
Thank you. So I guess picking up on where you just ended, so there were a number of questions on Sephardim and Ashkenazim and race and Jewish whiteness. So I guess, could you comment on how migration patterns out of Spain, how did that impact Ashkenazi Jewry and people who have Jewish Spanish blood in their ancestry? Are they white because of mixing between Sephardim and Ashkenazim, or because of, I don't know if it's a myth or not, that if you're white, it's because you have Cossack blood?
Wow, right. So that's a whole nother lecture. So, race, we try to consider as an actual scientific category, and really isn't. It's a social construct. And there was a time when all Jews and Irish, the the fairest of them all, right? Really fair-skinned Ashkenazi Jews and really fair-skinned Irish people in America were considered not white because of the way we look at things. So I'm going to step back from the idea of categorizing them as race, because in every era we redefine what that term means. In the era I'm talking about, there wasn't that concept. There was maybe edot, this idea of ethnic community. You were part of my ethnic group. And the Mustarabim, or Arabized Jews, were one. The Ashkenazim were another. The Sephardim were another. So you can imagine in Rome, in Cairo, you have Jews come from Germany and France, Jews who come from Castile and Aragon, and Jews who come from Morocco living together in that community. They see themselves as different edot. They see themselves as different ethnic enclaves, all sharing the same religion, Judaism. Some of those Sephardic Jews are fair-skinned. Some of them are dark-skinned. Some of those Moroccan Jews have light-colored eyes. Some of them don't. Some of those Jews from Germany are very, very dark eyes, dark skin, dark hair. Our image of, well, if you're fair-skinned, you come from Poland, or redheaded, you come from Poland, you couldn't come from Spain, is not exactly true. We have redheads in Spain at this time, as we do in Syria at this time, as we do in biblical times, right? So physiognomy, hair color, eye color, skin color is a little bit hard to map onto geography in the way that we might think it is at this time.
Okay, thank you for addressing that. I know that was a thorny one.
Yeah.
Okay, shifting gears a little bit, and this related to the response and the tshuva that you shared. There were questions on how the expulsion impacted the faith of the Jews. You know, the theodicy question, like, why did this horrible thing happen to us en masse? And sort of who were the Jewish communal authorities, and were they providing anything helpful to the community, as all this was happening? I think less so in in the context that you just shared, kind of after it all happened, but like really in the context of the expulsion, what did this mean in terms of the impact on the religious community and its leadership?
Good. So the writings we have are not from the poor. They're not from the dispossessed. They're all of the dispossessed. We have, or from women for the most part. We have Jewish scholars who write, and that's whose take on the expulsion we get. And for the most part, they fall back on a tried and true view of the universe, in which that the Jews who are being punished by God, and that human beings are the tools of God. So these kings are not punishing the Jews; they're but the tool of God to punish us for our sins. And if we are better Jews, one day He will send us the Messiah, and we will stop being punished. And so there's this reassertion of faith in God, and that this is somehow a just punishment. There's not a connected dots of anything we specifically did, but we failed to live up to the covenant, and therefore, we are being cast to the winds in this way. Does every rabbi who writes that actually believe it? Do they have no geopolitical sense? I can't say that, right? That's not the way that people write in this day and age. So this is a standard theological rationale. We do have some chronicles at the time that lay blame on certain kings or certain queens or certain events. Very often there's a sense of you do the best you can not to run afoul of your lords, your earthly lords. When you do the best that you can to find new lords who will protect you. But there's understanding that we are a minority. We do not have our own state or our own means of protecting ourselves. And therefore, we are at the mercy of other people. And we should do everything we can to bribe our way into their good graces. And when we can't, we suffer. And in those moments of suffering, the standard argument is we should help each other out, for we know what it's like to be in this position. But as I said, there's a limit to what you can actually do, even if you want to. And human nature being what it is, not everyone wants to the same degree.
So I wasn't planning to ask this, but a number of people have asked this.
Sure.
So I'm going to tack it on to what you were just saying. People are asking for clarification on actually what is the status of conversion in how does Jewish law see it, and specifically converting to Catholicism? Is it idolatry?
Right. So The standard at this time, I'm going to give you, I don't know what your rabbi says in your community, but the standard in the 16th century, the 15th and 16th century was all these conversions were considered to be, these are considered to be anusim. These are forced converts, and therefore they're still Jewish. But some of the dictum is Israel, although he sins, is still Israel, right? In this case, though he's made not to eat kosher, he's made to pray to a different God, he's being coerced to do it. He doesn't do it voluntarily, and therefore we cannot consider him a ger. We got to consider him, right, an anus. That's the legal take on what's going on. What popular opinion was varied greatly. And so you could say, Rabbi, I understand what you're saying. This guy who just shows up 100 years later from Portugal, not circumcised, doesn't know the prayers, never kept kosher in his life, neither did his parents or his grandparents. It was his great-grandparents who did. He wants to become Jewish. And you're telling me he doesn't have to reconvert because he never fully officially converted. Okay, but he ain't marrying my daughter. So you can say what you want halakhically. I'm a dyer, I'm a weaver, I'm no halakhic expert, but that guy ain't married into my family. So there's a court of public opinion here, right? So the rabbis generally held true to this standard halakhic notion that all of the people in Spain and Portugal were forced or coerced, and they fall into a legal category of those who don't provoke, as someone said. They're not provocatively converting. They're not trying to slam Judaism. That said, there's a functional reality that most of these Jews aren't going to let them into their congregation unless they make some sort of statement that they plan to live as a Jew, that they go through, the standard conversion process of having, a little blood removed, if not a full circumcision, that there's got to be some reversion or reconversion to Judaism thing happening here because there is a popular distrust of their bona fides, of their religious identity as Jews. Even as the rabbis say, technically, they don't have to do all those things. They're like, yeah, Rabbi, technically they don't, but they're not praying in our shul until they do, so let's get on with it.
Okay, and just another round of questions related to conversos, which I know is just a topic of such fascination.
Okay, so why don't we do one more, Julia, then we'll do a little bit more text, and then we'll have time at the end for any other questions.
I can also hold it till the end.
Yeah, let's hold it to the end. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions. So that's great. And we can go a little bit, I'll stay a little bit long if that's okay. All right, I'm going to share my screen again with you. And we're going to look at a text, a very famous text by Manasseh ben Israel. We're now in the 17th century, and we're in Amsterdam. And I will go to the little beginning of the text. You can see the title here. It's How Profitable the Nation of the Jews Are from 1655. And a rabbi named Manasseh ben Israel is writing from Amsterdam to Oliver Cromwell in England, hoping to have some of the Jews formally readmitted to England. I say formally because Jews have been living illegally in England, some of them as conversos, some of them as open Jews. I mean, it's a lot of don't ask, don't tell. Everyone realizes that they're probably former converts. If they're speaking Portuguese in 1655, they grew up as Catholics. But they say they're Jews. They've always been Jews, even though the only language they speak is Portuguese, even though they're dressed as Portuguese merchants. So what Manasseh ben Israel wants is a formal declaration to reverse the expulsion of 1290, to formally declare Jews are openly welcome back into England. The reason he's trying this is that Cromwell's Protestant. And writing from Protestant Holland, from a Protestant city in Amsterdam, Manasseh ben Israel, himself of Sephardic ancestry, notes that there are Christians and there are Christians. It turns out now we're in the 17th century, Protestant Christians would be happier to stick it to their Catholic rivals by allowing former Catholics, now Jews, to settle than they are, willing to push the Jews out. So Amsterdam, London, Hamburg, these Protestant cities of Northern Europe, together with the Ottoman Empire, the Muslim cities, allow for these conversos to come because they don't care if you used to be Catholic. Italy, it's a problem. There's an Inquisition in Italy. If you used to be Catholic in Italy, you have to pretend to still be Catholic or find a way of proving you were never Catholic. No one's asking those questions in Holland or England. And so in Holland, you could be a Sephardic, let's just say Portuguese Jew, and no one will ask where you were born or what your first communion was like. And because of the success of Jews in Protestant Holland, there's a thought that, well, maybe England can be the next big place for allowing Jews to settle. It's particularly acute because once you hear that Amsterdam is accepting former conversos, accepting Sephardic Jews, well, there's just a pouring of refugees in there. Remember, all of these poor Jews looking for permanent settlement. Now here, there's a place, a rapidly growing mercantile center in Amsterdam that you can get work, you can get a community, you can get help. And Amsterdam quickly becomes swamped. So one of the rabbinic leaders is trying to find another place for the runoff, the rest of the refugees to go, and he's petitioning England. It doesn't work. But his letter is instructive for a number of reasons, and we'll read a little bit here. I want to start up, you can take time to read the piece on your own, but I want to start up here at the bottom of page 9, in this last line that it says, "Now, in this dispersion of the Jews, our forefathers flying from the Spanish Inquisition, some of them came to Holland, others got into Italy, and others betook themselves into Asia," this is Asia Minor or Turkey, "and so easily they credit one another, and by that means they draw the negotiation wherever they are, wherewith all of them merchandising and having perfect knowledge of all kinds of monies, diamonds, cochineal, which is a red dye, indigo, wines, oil, and other commodities that serve from place to place, especially holding correspondence with their friend and kinsfolk, whose language they understand, they do abundantly enrich the lands and countries of strangers." I'm going to pause right there because Manasseh didn't have a good editor. He wrote some really long sentences. Here we're arguing what I just told you. Some of the Jews went to Italy, some went to the Ottoman Empire, some of them came to Holland, but they continue to trade with one another because they have a shared language. In other words, Spanish and Portuguese remain the language of the Sephardic diaspora generations later. This is 1655, well over a century later. They keep their Spanish and Portuguese language as a mean of creating this international community, and they become, at least the ones he's talking about, international global merchants. They traded money and diamond and other luxury goods and other commodities with their friends and kinsmen. So you have this idea of a multinational network of Jewish families trading with one another with this common language they have. And because of this, they are a good bet for settlers. They will abundantly enrich you, Ollie, if you allow them to come to England. This is the theme, how profitable they are. How profitable these Jews will be to England if England lets them back in. You might have heard we're going to be a drain on your economy, that we're poor, that we're beggars. Not so. We're actually going to enrich you. And this becomes the main theme of the piece. But then I want to pick up again here at the bottom of the page. This reason is the more strengthened when we see that not only the Jewish nation dwelling in Holland and Italy traffics with their own stocks, but also with the riches of many others of their own nation, friends, kinsmen, and acquaintance, which notwithstanding live in Spain. These merchants deal with friends and family who are still in Spain. Here's the argument. 160, 70, 80, 90 years after the conversions. My cousins in Spain, who are now 4th, 5th generation Catholics, they're still my cousins. I'm keeping in touch with them. We see ourselves as a united diaspora. The Jewish Catholic divide is not that big a deal for us. We are Sephardim. Some of our Sephardic family practices Catholicism. Some of our Sephardic family practices Judaism. But at least when it comes to matters of trade, but I would also say in other matters, in matters of marriage, in matters of settlement, we see ourselves as one Sephardic community. The word nation here is often rendered in Portuguese as nação, right? We are homens de nação. We are men of the nation. We are people of the nation. The nation being not Jews, but Jews and Catholics of a common Sephardic ancestry. That is to say, as long as your ancestors were once Spanish and Portuguese Jews, it doesn't matter if you guys are Spanish and Portuguese Jews. Some of that same thinking that Christians use to demean or denounce the new Christians, you conversos will always be Jewish. Manasseh ben Israel is accepting as well, but he's turning it on its head, saying, yeah, we also agree these people will also be Jews. We hang out with them still. Their Catholicism doesn't bother us. Our Judaism doesn't bother them. They're not leaving Lisbon anytime soon. It's good for them to be in Lisbon. Now I have a man in Lisbon that I can trust. And you, Oliver Cromwell, should be in business with me, who has a man in Lisbon, a man in Istanbul, a man in Mexico City, a man in Cartagena. Some of them are Catholics, some of them are Jews, right? And to continue the text, and among us, we send unto them monies and goods, which they hold in their hands and content themselves with a very small portion of their estate, to the end they may be secure and free from danger that might happen for what might happen unto them in case they should fall under the yoke of the Inquisition. We don't want for much. We keep a little bit of money in reserve in case we get into trouble. But other than that, we trade with our Jewish friends. At this time in the 17th century, it's kind of an open secret. Some of the people in Spain, some of the people in Portugal still deal with their cousins in Italy, in Holland, in North Africa, in Ottoman Empire, those cousins who are Jewish. Are these Spanish and Portuguese conversos or Catholics? Are they crypto Jews? Hard to say. Many of them, it seems, are actually Catholic. It's just that their Catholicism is only part of their identity. Their Jewish cultural heritage and their family connections with Jews living throughout the world is important to them. They rely on these family and friend connections more than they do the Catholics in their home parish, who they don't really trust. So theologically, they might be Catholic. Culturally, and in terms of economics and family, they see themselves as men of the Sephardic nation. I'm going to end my screen here, my screen share here. We have another text. We don't really have time because I want to leave some time for questions at the end. There's a quest by Peter Stuyvesant that will show you that some of the first Jews in North America are sort of the positive end of the story. I wanted to end it a little bit positively. In the 1650s, around the same time as this letter to Cromwell, you have Jews who sit on the board of the Dutch West India Company, who've made it, right? They've found a place to settle. They're no longer wandering. Some of their less fortunate brethren are still wandering. They're in Brazil. They get kicked out of Brazil when the Portuguese conquer it. Brazil used to be Dutch. They get kicked out of Dutch Brazil when the Portuguese conquer it, and they're going to try to find another Dutch settlement, and they end up in Dutch New Amsterdam, what is today New York. And Peter Stuyvesant wants to kick them out. Peter Stuyvesant at that time is the local governor working not for Holland, but for the Dutch West India Company. And the Dutch West India Company write him a letter saying, we know what you're saying, the Jews are trouble, no one wants Jews, who wants Jews as their colonists? But since several of our board members are Jewish, Pete, we're going to tell you, accept them and stop complaining. And that's really the birth of Jewish life in North America, as it would be. So we do see eventually those Jews who can help the refugees do exert themselves on their behalf. And that is the beginning, in many ways, of a long-standing relationship between some of these well-placed Jews in Europe and Jews throughout the Sephardic diaspora. We can talk about the creation of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, a French philanthropic organization that helps Jews in North Africa and the Middle East in the 19th century. But this is really the beginning of it. So I wanted to end sort of on a little bit of a positive note. This doesn't happen, doesn't stay forever. But look at the dates, 1492 to 1655. It's a long time where many of these Jews are constantly looking for a place to land and dependent on the largesse of both Jewish and Christian leaders in order to hold body and soul together. That's going to be it for today. I'm going to open it up for questions, however, and Julia, you can direct them my way.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. My chat is full of comments just about what a fascinating and wonderful lecture it is, which you're bringing back to Professor Gampel's class from my time at JTS. So really, it's thank you so much. So I was just picking up on what you just ended with. So it sounds like what you're saying is kind of, the mixing and the migration it created tensions, as you showed us in the tshuva, and talked about, I wouldn't want him to marry my daughter, kind of thing. And at the same time, it's reinforcing of a sense of Jewish peoplehood in kind of a global way. Is that, would it be too far to say that?
Yeah, I mean, it does reinforce a sense of Jewish peoplehood and of mutual benefit and mutual dependence. It also shows that there's not unilateral buy-in, right? Not everyone wants to help the widow and the orphan to the same degree. Some people will look for reasons why this widow and this orphan don't count because they had a chance and they blew it. And why should I, as a believing Jew who suffered so, why should I really reach out to help them? And that's the human, I think, the human nature aspect of this. We like to think of ourselves as so unique, and very often unique and better than many of the people we see in the world, many of the non-Jews. Sometimes we are, sometimes we're not.
Right. Okay, before I go back to the Conversos, because there's so many questions there, just one thing that I don't think you mentioned, a couple of people asked about Ladino, and when did that, was it actually a spoken language? When did it become a spoken language? Just if you could kind of shed some light there.
Yeah, excellent. So what we call Ladino, the name is one of many names for Judeo-Spanish, a Romance language of the late Middle Ages with Hebrew and other loanwords mixed in. So the Judesmo or Ladino or Spaniol, it's called a lot of different things. In Salonika might be a little bit different from the Spaniol spoken in Fez, but they're related, right? They're versions of medieval Spanish that changed as it went out. And eventually with the printing press, people start writing certain types of Ladino and they change over time. So at some printing presses will go with a type of Ladino popular in one part of the world, and other printing presses will go with a Ladino popular in another part of the world. They're usually mutually intelligible though. If you can speak or read one, you can speak or connect with someone whose Ladino is a little bit different than yours. But this form of Judeo-Spanish really is Jews leaving Spain and Portugal and clinging to that language, but also augmenting it a little bit. So Judeo-Spanish in the 15th century is a little different than Judeo-Spanish in the 19th century, but again, mutually intelligible.
And they were using it in the context that you just talked about as a spoken language?
Yes.
That's how
right.
they, okay.
So Spanish and Portuguese. So some of the Jews who leave, some of the Catholics who leave Portugal and revert to Judaism, like Manasseh ben Israel, probably spoke clean Portuguese at the time. Those Jews who leave earlier on, their language of the Middle Ages is caught in amber a little bit more. And so they're going to speak a Judeo-Spanish that we have accounts, for instance, of Spanish missionaries showing up in Jerusalem like 100 years after 1492 and hearing like archaic Castilian and thinking, who speaks this way? It'd be like you walked to New York and hearing someone speaking like Shakespeare. It's like, that's so odd. Who speaks this beautiful old Castilian? And they're like, well, this is what we left with and we never really stopped speaking it. So it becomes a lingua franca of the Sephardic diaspora, along with Portuguese for hundreds of years. It's kind of dying out now in the 21st century, but you can still find some pockets of people who still speak it.
It's so interesting. And we have kind of our own version of that. People who, spent time in Israel and learned like Ben Yehuda kind of Hebrew, which is not how Israelis talk at all. Okay, great. Okay, so let's turn back to the Conversos. So I'll take it one at a time because we have a few minutes. Okay, so there were a few questions about Conversos of today, or people who identify as having Converso background, and especially in certain regions. Would you take that at face value if someone expresses an awareness of that in their family history?
Yeah, so it's a big topic now, right? So the American Southwest is a hotbed of this. There are a notion that some of these conversos who come to the New World, not to live openly as Jews, but just to not be harassed by the Inquisition. Eventually, the Inquisition is reestablished, and so they constantly flee up the Royal Road, towards New Mexico, or so that is the theory. There are some people who don't agree with that theory. that some people think it's an interesting theory, but there's really not much more proof. There's those people who say, okay, but biologically, you might have Jewish ancestors. If you, in the past 500 years, have no Jewish consciousness or Jewish practice, how are we to still call you anusim, but not something else? Like, at what point? And there are debates among halakhic scholars about this. Not quite clear how some of these people would prove matrilineal lineage at this point, right? They don't have the documents. They didn't know they had a Jewish background. And some people really say, I don't really have any reason to believe other than my family does have a heritage that goes from the conquistadors on up to New Mexico. I wonder if I am. I bet I am. So do you believe that? Do you not believe that? I kind of feel like at this point in life, if someone wants to commit themselves to Judaism, there are ways to do that, and there are ways to call yourself Jewish. And if there are ways to say, you know what, I might have this very interesting heritage, I don't know that changes the way I behave religiously today.
Right. So let me just press it. That was very helpful. Let me just press a tiny bit. So someone who has practices in their family that, it's not just a kind of a general picture of family history, the way you just talked about it, but say, my mom and grandmother always lit candles on Friday night, that kind of thing. Would you consider that? And it's not a halachic question either, but just, in terms of ancestry, would you, just your scholarly opinion, do you think there's something there, or there's just no way to know?
There's potentially something there, but I don't know how you determine, because so some people will say, well, my family's name is Toledano, so we must come from Toledo. That's absolutely possible. It's also possible you were a Silesian Jew who ended up working as a maid in the household of the Toledano family, and you took their name at a time when people were associating them. You were, Rachel, the scullery maid, and you became Rachel, the scullery maid of the Toledano household. There are all sorts of ways that practices, names, dress, other things creep into our history over 500 years, and it's not always a straight line. So I don't know, did you light candles in the basement because you had a Jewish side of the family to do that and you went to go live with them, but your side of the family wasn't? I don't know. It's like recipes, can we really trace that back as identity just because the recipe exists in your family? Maybe, maybe not. It's fascinating, but I don't know how you see it as a smoking gun per se.
Okay, that's really helpful. Okay, so there was a question that I hadn't heard of this, but someone was asking about, I guess apparently there's like the same way we have Holocaust deniers, there are deniers of the fact that there was mass forced conversion in Spain, deniers of crypto Judaism existing. Is that something that you know about, or that you can share anything with us?
Yeah, I mean, there's a spectrum of belief, and there's people all along the spectrum. I would say that, as you might imagine, in Spain, the people who want to see their country as a force for good will very often downplay in their history moments like the forced conversions of 1391 and the expulsion of 1492. Others will say, mea culpa, that was wrong, and we only move forward by admitting it. And there's a split in that. There is a great variety of education on this issue in Spain, as there are in the United States or Israel or any place else. So there's a lot of low-grade knowledge or information that are things that pass for information on this. So there are people who, don't have a mean bone in their body who said, but everything I've been taught at the Catholic school I went to or in my family was that this is a hoax. It never happened. You try to educate those people and try to push back on that and show them actually it did. But yeah, there's a certain existence of that out there. There are those who say the Jews had it bad, but the Muslims had it worse, and there's a reason why they would promote that narrative.
Okay, got it. All right, let's end on a fun note. So,
please.
So one person asked, is there any validity to the rumor that King Ferdinand was a converso? And another person asked the same question about Columbus.
Right. So not really on King Ferdinand. On Columbus, yeah, we don't have the smoking gun we'd like to have. It's certainly possible that he might have some Converso ancestry. He doesn't really seem to be conscious of any Converso identity. There was a time when that was really played up. Yeah, I always answer this by saying, I think of the guy who went to Arta. All right, he wanted to be a Jew, but he also wanted to settle as a well-off Jew. He wasn't gonna leave Catholicism that quickly. There are clearly a lot of people in Spanish and Portuguese life in the past 500 years who technically have Muslim and Jewish blood somewhere in their family tree. If they never embrace it, if they never make an effort to embrace it, even in secret, if we have no evidence that they thought of themselves as converso or proud of that, or yearned for a time when they could live as a halakhic Jew, I don't know how it benefits us to say, yeah, but technically, 1/18th, they were Jewish. At some point, I lose interest. If there's no interest in them to embrace Judaism, then they're Catholics.
Right. So when we were putting together this series, and I was working with Tani, who's not here today, but I said we can't do this series without a session on the expulsion from Spain. So I'm feeling very affirmed in that statement, because you've told us such a great and absorbing story, but also just really encapsulated so many aspects of the wandering theme of this series. How the just kind of all of the religious and cultural and linguistic and geographical and theological issues at play between Jews and their host countries. You've told us an amazing and really nuanced story of wandering and of Jewish journeys. So up until even ending with the New World here. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And I think, do I remember correctly that you're teaching in our fall series?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So everyone who I know people love the session today. You have to come back in the fall. On that note, we have Professor David Kramer will be finishing up our series, this summer series, next week. So definitely join us for that. Between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, Vice Chancellor Rabbi Gordon Tucker will be doing a session, just kind of a standalone. And then, as I said, after the holidays, we'll be starting a new fall series, which I'm very excited about. And stay tuned. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Thank you once again to Professor Ray. It was wonderful teaching today.
Thank you, guys. Be well.